Power can command armies, it cannot command the body. In this second part, we meet rulers who tried to govern through agony, madness, and decay. Some hid their wounds behind ceremony, others bled in public, their pain reshaping empires. Watch how disease twisted policy, toppled dynasties, and rewrote history itself. King George III is often remembered as the Mad King who lost America. The long-reigning British monarch, 60 years on the throne, oversaw the tumultuous late 18th century, including the American Revolution. But beyond the political events, George III faced a more personal battle, a mysterious illness that drove him into periods of insanity. For decades, historians have debated the nature of his ailment. The classic theory is that George III suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic metabolic disorder, hence the famed symptom of purple urine. Others suggest bipolar disorder or another mental illness. Whatever the cause, the king experienced bouts of mental breakdown so severe that he sometimes had to be restrained from harming himself. His story is a poignant example of a monarch brought low by a hidden sickness. King George's first major episode came in 1788. The king, normally a diligent, if unimaginative man, began to show alarming changes. He became increasingly talkative and agitated, speaking rapidly for hours on end. Courtiers recorded that he would talk straight through the night, without pause, his speech so pressured and disorganized that it was almost gibberish. His mood seesawed from frantic cheerfulness to explosive rage. Hallucinations haunted him. He claimed to converse with long-dead people or believed he was in conversation with angels. He suffered terrible insomnia and went days without proper sleep. Physically, the king was in pain. He complained of stomach cramps and constipation, and indeed one hallmark of his condition was that his urine turned a strange bluish-purple color, a detail that later gave credence to the porphyria diagnosis. In one infamous incident, George's doctors reported that his urine was colored like port wine and smelled atrocious. The Mad King had to endure humiliating treatments by 18th century doctors. They blistered his skin, gagged him with medicines, and at times restrained him in a straitjacket or a special chair when he became too unruly. Imagine the King of Great Britain strapped into a chair, foaming spittle on his lips as he rants for hours about misdeeds of long-dead ministers or nonsense about the crown jewels. That was the reality during George's worst episodes. George III did recover from that 1788 to 1789 bout of madness, returning to rule, and even to relative mental health for some years. But the illness was episodic. It struck again in 1801, and most severely in 1810, after George was rocked by the death of his beloved youngest daughter. This time the madness did not recede. The aging king's mind slipped completely. He was nearly blind from cataracts and in constant pain from rheumatism, which only aggravated his delirium. By late 1810, King George was so deranged that he was confined in Windsor Castle, howling and babbling incoherently for hours on end. He spoke nonsense until his voice gave out and then kept moving his lips. He claimed he had conversations with the dead and often did not know where or when he was. It was said he addressed imaginary people as if they stood before him. One account describes him trying to shake hands with an oak tree, believing it to be the King of Prussia. At times he grew violent, lashing out at his attendants or trying to smash furniture. The once formidable king, who had prided himself on personal morality and propriety, now had to be watched like a child, lest he hurt himself. He was occasionally seen wearing foxtails or farm folks' clothing during his madness, a far cry from his royal robes. In 1811, it became clear that the king was incapable of performing any duties. Parliament enacted a regency, making George's son, the future George IV, the prince regent to rule in his father's stead. King George III spent the last decade of his life locked away, completely insane, deaf, and nearly blind, oblivious to the world. He was king in name only. When he finally died in 1820, he had been removed from public sight for years. George III's illness had profound effects on the monarchy's reputation. His periods of madness, especially the protracted final one, undermined the aura of royal authority. Satirists had a field day with the Mad King, and the public's respect for the crown diminished, arguably contributing to a long-term trend of the monarchy becoming more ceremonial. During the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, George was still mentally competent, but colonists' propaganda painted him as a tyrant or even suggested madness. Had his severe breakdown occurred a decade earlier, it might have completely altered the course of that conflict. A mentally absent king could have led Britain to sue for peace earlier or handle the war differently. In any case, by losing the American colonies and suffering bouts of insanity, George III's reign marked the beginning of the end of the old imperial confidence. His personal suffering evoked sympathy, but also symbolized an empire that seemed to be losing its divine mandate. The madness of King George remains one of history's sobering reminders that on the throne sits a human being, subject to the cruelest twists of biology. Few royal lives illustrate the perils of inbreeding and genetic curse like that of King Charles II of Spain. Known to his subjects as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, Charles II's entire existence was marked by illness, deformity, and suffering. He was the last of Spain's great Habsburg dynasty, a line of kings infamous for intermarrying to keep power in the family. By the time Charles was born in 1661, generations of uncle-niece and cousin unions had accumulated a nightmarish set of genetic problems in one poor individual. Charles II became king as a child and ruled for 35 years, but he never truly grew up, physically or mentally. His contemporaries described him as deformed, epileptic, sterile, and barely able to chew or speak. He truly seemed cursed from birth, and indeed many in Spain whispered that witchcraft or sorcery must be behind the king's pitiful condition, hence the nickname Bewitched. The reality was rooted not in magic, but in biology. Charles II's appearance shocked even those accustomed to courtly ugliness. He had the trademark Habsburg jaw, an oversized, protruding lower jaw so extreme that Charles could not properly close his mouth. His tongue was said to be so large that he had difficulty speaking. Words came out garbled and drooling. He didn't learn to talk until age 4 and couldn't walk until roughly age 8. The king's body was lanky and thin, but his head was enormous with a bulging forehead. He suffered from frequent seizures, epilepsy, that would send him into convulsions on his palace floors. During these fits, courtiers could only watch in dread as their monarch foamed at the mouth and thrashed about, entirely lost to the world. Charles was also legally blind in some accounts, or at least very poor of sight. He had almost no education. Some reports say he was functionally illiterate and possessed the mind of a child even in adulthood. Throughout his life, Charles was plagued by illnesses. He had chronic intestinal problems. Severe diarrhea and vomiting bouts would weaken him for weeks. He would become feverish and bedridden for long stretches, during which people feared he'd die. Astonishingly, he survived infancy and childhood despite these challenges, a testament perhaps to careful, if misguided care, and sheer luck. He married twice to 2 beautiful princesses in hopes of continuing the dynasty. But Charles was impotent or infertile. He could never father a child. His first wife reported that he was incapable of consummating the marriage. Spain waited in vain for an heir as the king grew into his 30s with no offspring. Meanwhile, his health only worsened. In his final years, Charles was half paralyzed. He had great difficulty moving his legs and often had to be carried or supported. He drooled constantly and lost what few teeth he had. His fragile body shook with tremors. Foreign ambassadors at the Spanish court sent home ghastly reports that the king appeared more dead than alive, describing him as the most wretched invalid ever to occupy a throne. Priests performed exorcisms, convinced that the king's degenerated state was due to demonic possession or a hex. Charles himself believed he was cursed. He spent long hours in prayer when he was lucid, beseeching God to lift whatever evil had befallen him. King Charles II died in the autumn of 1700 at just 38 years old, ending the Habsburg line in Spain. The autopsy of his body, if it can be believed, was as grotesque as expected. The examining doctors allegedly found no blood in his heart, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotted and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Whether literal or exaggerated, this report captures the truth that Charles was destroyed from within by his lineage. His miserable condition meant he was unable to effectively govern. Spain, in his era, fell into stagnation and decline, while power was wielded by his regents and favorites. More critically, Charles II's death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. Competing dynasties, the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs, claimed the Spanish throne. The result was a massive European war, 1701 to 1714, that drew in dozens of kingdoms and caused great suffering. Spain itself became a battleground and lost its status as the dominant European power. In a way, Charles's broken body broke an empire. His life and death signaled the end of one royal house and ushered in a new era under the French Bourbon kings. The tragic figure of Charles II, a monarch so incapacitated that he was more a puppet than a king, remains a powerful lesson. Generations of power kept in one family had produced not a Superman, but a crippled man, unable to sire even an heir. The bewitched king indeed appeared cursed, but the curse was man-made, a genetic dead end that obliterated a dynasty and sparked a continent-wide conflict. King Henry VIII is infamous for his outsized life and outsized appetites, 6 marriages, the creation of the Church of England, sumptuous feasts, and ruthless executions. But by his later years, Henry's body had become his greatest enemy. The once athletic young king, tall, handsome, and an accomplished jouster, turned into an obese, disease-ridden tyrant. Henry's ailments were numerous: infected leg ulcers, possible syphilis, and gross obesity chief among them. These afflictions not only caused him constant agony, they also warped his personality, turning him increasingly cruel and paranoid. The mighty Tudor king who had broken with the Pope and taken whatever, or whomever, he wanted, was ultimately laid low by his own. In his 20s, Henry VIII was the picture of robust manhood, broad-shouldered and vigorous. But fate dealt him a blow in 1536, when a jousting accident changed everything. Henry was thrown from his horse, and the horse fell on him, badly injuring the king's leg. The injury never healed properly. The wound on his leg ulcerated, becoming a chronic pus-filled ulcer that tormented Henry for the rest of his life. This ulcer would periodically burst and drain foul-smelling pus. Attendants had to continually open and clean the sore, a process that left Henry in screaming pain. The wound often got reinfected, swelling his leg to the size of a tree trunk. Some accounts say you could smell the king's infected legrooms away. Unable to exercise like before, Henry began to pile on weight. He went from a fit young man to an enormously fat, older man. By the 1540s, his waist was reportedly over 50 inches around, requiring specially reinforced chairs to hold him. His once chiseled face bloated, and his eyes bulged from the fat encasing his neck. Alongside the leg ulcer, Henry likely suffered from type 2 diabetes, given his lifestyle, or gout. He had throbbing joint pains and perhaps diabetic neuropathy that made his feet ache. Additionally, many historians believe Henry had syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection common in that era. Syphilis, in its later stages, can cause neurological problems and personality changes, as well as skin lesions. While it's not definitively proven Henry had syphilis, it has long been part of his legend because he exhibited symptoms consistent with it. Open sores, though his could be from the ulcer alone, bouts of insanity or irrational behavior, and infertility issues. He had difficulty siring healthy sons, with many stillbirths and infant deaths among his offspring. If Henry did contract syphilis, he might have been treated with mercury, a common but toxic remedy that could itself cause tremors and mental decline. As Henry's health deteriorated, so did his temper. The constant pain from his ulcerous leg and other ailments made him irritable, then furious, and finally downright monstrous. He found it harder to sleep. The pain kept him awake at night, and he became addicted to strong analgesic potions containing things like opium. His court noted that the king would erupt at the slightest provocation. Once charming and generous, he turned merciless and suspicious. In his final years, Henry executed some of his closest advisors and former friends. Even the brilliant Thomas Cromwell, who had served him loyally, met the chopping block. Perhaps in part because Henry's volatile moods demanded someone to blame for his misery. He even executed one of his wives, Catherine Howard, and nearly executed another. His last wife, Catherine Parr, narrowly escaped his wrath during this twilight of his reign. It is widely believed that the excruciating pain and possible syphilitic brain damage contributed to Henry's legendary cruelty and paranoia. For example, the young, sprightly Henry might never have ordered the beheading of his beloved second wife, Anne Boleyn, on dubious charges. But the 45-year-old Henry, obese, crippled, and furious at the world, did just that. He was a king in constant torment, lashing out at anyone who crossed him. By early 1547, King Henry VIII was a moribund giant, weighed down by 300-plus pounds of flesh, carried on a special contraption of ropes and machines to move him from room to room. He was barely 55 years old, but looked far older. That January, the infected ulcer on his leg, along with kidney failure, and possibly a final bout of fever from whatever syphilitic or diabetic complications he had, brought Henry to his end. It's said that as he lay dying, the stench from his leg wound was so awful that few could bear to remain in the room. He died surrounded by the smell of his own decay. There is a gruesome story, likely apocryphal but symbolic, that his corpse, lying in state in his coffin, burst open overnight, with gas and fluids from his diseased body oozing out onto the floor, where dogs lapped up the spilled royal remains. True or not, the image encapsulates how far this once magnificent king had fallen. Henry VIII's demise had significant consequences. His longed-for male heir, the boy King Edward VI, was sickly and died young, leading to a succession crisis and more bloodshed, including the execution of Henry's daughter Mary's rivals, and eventually the reign of Elizabeth I. But beyond the immediate political results, Henry's life and death altered England permanently. His break from the Catholic Church, partly to facilitate his marriages and divorces in pursuit of a healthy heir, led to the English Reformation, changing the religion of the nation. His tyrannical late rule hammered home the idea that absolute power could corrupt absolutely, especially when combined with bodily suffering and illness. Henry's enormous presence looms over English history, and his personal downfall due to disease is a stark reminder that even a man who made himself head of the church and supreme lord of the land was at the end only flesh and blood. The mighty lion of Tudor England was reduced to a bedridden invalid whose roar became a whimper. His brutality and religious reforms reshaped England, but his diseased body shaped Henry's own destiny most of all. The story of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem is one of the most poignant in the annals of Crusader kings. Baldwin IV ruled the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1170s, and he did so while suffering from one of history's most dreaded diseases, leprosy. Known to his people as the Leper King, Baldwin's short life was defined by incredible courage in the face of a flesh-eating illness. His tale combines the glory and violence of the Crusades with the tragic fate of a young man slowly dying in plain sight. Baldwin was only a boy when it became evident something was terribly wrong. It's said that one day the prince and his friends were playing rough, and Baldwin didn't cry out or react when his arm got badly scraped. Noticing this, his tutor realized the prince felt no pain in his arm, a very ominous sign. Court physicians confirmed the worst. Baldwin had leprosy, likely contracted in early childhood. In the 12th century, leprosy, today known as Hansen's disease, was essentially incurable and eventually fatal. It caused the progressive decay of the body, skin lesions, nerve damage, muscle weakness, and disfigurement. Many kings might have been shunned or forced aside with such a diagnosis, but Baldwin's father had died and he was the heir. At 13 years old, Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem, fully aware that his body was a ticking time bomb. Baldwin refused to let his disease define his reign, at least at first. As a teenager, he displayed extraordinary resolve and piety. Despite numb hands and feet, despite patches of numb, discolored skin and early signs of deformity, Baldwin donned armor and took to the field to defend his kingdom from its greatest adversary, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. In 1177, at the famous Battle of Montgisard, 16-year-old Baldwin IV led a vastly outnumbered Christian army against Saladin's forces. So advanced was Baldwin's leprosy by that point that he had to be carried on horseback, literally tied into the saddle so he wouldn't fall, because his hands could barely grip the reins and his legs had lost sensation. Imagine the scene: Baldwin in his shining helmet and cloak with a crimson cross, his youthful face already showing blotches of illness, strapped to his horse like a corpse propped up, yet still charging into battle. And charge he did. Baldwin fought ferociously, and the Crusaders won a stunning victory over Saladin that day. The Leper King's bravery became legendary. Even his enemies respected him as a worthy foe. However, Baldwin's triumphs could only delay the inevitable. As he entered his 20s, the leprosy gnawed away at him. The disease progressed rapidly. Baldwin's fingers and toes began to curl and disfigure. His face developed lesions, and he likely went blind in one eye. Contemporary accounts hint that his eyesight deteriorated to the point he might have been completely blind by the end. He frequently had to be carried on a litter as walking became impossible. Yet he still tried to lead, making appearances in full regalia to assure his people. There's a tragic description of Baldwin in his final years, his once handsome face wrapped in bandages to cover oozing sores, only a single eye visible, blazing with determination as he presided over his court. By 1183, Baldwin's condition was so debilitating that the kingdom appointed a regent, his sister and her husband, to rule in his name. Even so, when Saladin's armies threatened the kingdom, Baldwin would haul himself out one last time, literally carried on a stretcher at the head of his troops to maintain morale. It was as if sheer willpower kept him alive and fighting. Baldwin IV finally succumbed to his illness in 1185, at around 24 years old. He had reigned just under a decade. His death left Jerusalem in a precarious state. He had no children. The throne passed to his young nephew, and then through a series of convoluted claims that ultimately put a weak king, Guy de Lusignan, in charge. Without Baldwin's steady if fragile hand, the kingdom soon fell into disaster. Within 2 years of Baldwin's death, Saladin defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin, 1187, and then went on to capture Jerusalem itself, ending nearly a century of Christian rule of the Holy City. Many at the time, and historians since, have speculated that had Baldwin IV lived longer, or had he been healthy and able to personally lead his armies, the Kingdom of Jerusalem might have withstood Saladin's onslaught. Baldwin's plight had forced him to rely on unstable regents and factional nobles, which weakened the realm. In a sense, the kingdom died from the same disease that killed the king, a gradual decay from within that made it unable to resist external conquest. The Leper King's story became legendary, a young monarch literally falling to pieces from leprosy, but never abandoning his duty. It's a tale of noble suffering that has been romanticized in chronicles and even modern movies, yet the ending is undeniably tragic. Baldwin's heroism could not overcome the rot of his flesh, and once he was gone, all he had fought for crumbled. His life is a stark reminder that even the greatest courage can be checked by the limitations of the human body. Topping our list is a ruler whose very name has become synonymous with brutality. Ivan IV of Russia, known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan reigned as the first Tsar of Russia from 1547 to 1584, and his rule was a paradox of grand achievements and horrific violence. In his youth, Ivan was an intelligent and ambitious prince who modernized Russia's laws and expanded its territory. But Ivan also had a cruel streak and a fierce temper, which only worsened over time. In his later years, Ivan the Terrible was a wreck of a man, tormented by chronic illness and possible poisoning, conditions that magnified his paranoia and rage to dangerous extremes. His physical disintegration and mental descent culminated in one of the most tragic episodes in royal history. Ivan, in a fit of madness, killed his own beloved son. His death soon after plunged Russia into chaos. The exact ailments that Ivan suffered have been debated. We know from historical accounts that he endured episodes of debilitating illness from middle age onward. He would be bedridden with fevers, severe abdominal pains, and sores on his body. Modern scientists got a clue in the 20th century when Ivan's grave was opened and his remains examined. They found extraordinarily high levels of mercury in his bones. This suggests Ivan may have been consuming mercury-laden potions, possibly as a treatment for syphilis. Mercury was a common, albeit toxic, cure for venereal disease in those days, or other ailments, or perhaps he was slowly poisoned by enemies. Mercury poisoning could cause tremors, mood swings, and cognitive decline, all symptoms Ivan exhibited. He suffered from bone degeneration and joint pain as well, likely arthritis or osteoarthritis, which left him limping and often racked with aches. Reports from foreigners at Ivan's court in the 1580s describe the Tsar as grotesquely bloated and covered in sores, with a long, unkempt beard, prone to twitching and collapsing without warning. They say he carried a peculiar odor of ointments and sickness. As his body failed him, Ivan's notorious paranoia grew to monstrous proportions. He had always been suspicious. Earlier in his reign, he had established the oprichnina, a state within a state run by his black-clad oprichniki henchmen who terrorized the nobility and massacred whole cities, like Novgorod, at Ivan's command. But now, nearing the end of his life, Ivan saw conspiracies everywhere. He reportedly kept moving his residence from one Kremlin palace to another, never staying put, to avoid being targeted by magic or poison. He surrounded himself with astrologers and soothsayers, desperately seeking any remedy or prediction to ease his mind and body. Yet he also continued his cruel outbursts. During one such rage in 1581, Ivan committed the act that would haunt Russia. He struck and killed his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. The story goes that the Tsar got into a violent argument with his pregnant daughter-in-law, the young wife of his son, possibly over her clothing being too immodest. He physically assaulted her, causing her to miscarry. His son, Prince Ivan, horrified and enraged, yelled at his father for his cruelty. The Tsar, in a red fury, smashed his son on the head with his royal staff. Some say it was a pointed staff or spear. The blow was severe. The 27-year-old prince crumpled, bleeding from a skull wound. Ivan the Terrible immediately realized what he had done. There is a famous painting depicting the scene, the Tsar cradling his dying son, eyes bulging in grief and terror as the life spills out of the young man. Despite frantic efforts, the Tsarevich died within days, leaving Ivan the Terrible heirless except for a weak younger son. This horrific act may well have been the result of Ivan's deteriorating mental state, amplified by illness and possibly toxic treatments. After killing his son, Ivan was plunged into despair. Witnesses say he howled in remorse and never psychologically recovered. Physically, too, he was declining fast. By early 1584, Ivan was so unwell he could barely stand without assistance. His legs were swollen, possibly with edema or varicose ulcers, his spine twisted by disease, and his hands shook from either essential tremor or poison-induced nerve damage. Still, the tyrant clung to life, paranoid about imminent death. He even ordered sorcerers to come and try to extend his life through magic. On March 18, 1584, Ivan attempted to follow some astrologer's advice to strengthen himself by playing a game of chess. It was during this chess match that Ivan the Terrible collapsed and died, likely from a stroke or heart failure, or perhaps a final overdose of his mercury-laced elixirs. He was 53 years old. When the servants approached, they found the once dreaded Tsar lying over the chessboard, motionless and bloated, a dark liquid dripping from his mouth. Some chroniclers mention this detail, feeding speculation of poison. Ivan's death marked the end of the Rurik dynasty's male line and threw Russia into a succession crisis. The only surviving heir was Ivan's mentally disabled son, Fyodor I, who became Tsar, but was a feeble puppet. Real power fell to nobles and eventually Boris Godunov. What followed was a period of political upheaval, famine, pretenders claiming to be Ivan's lost son. One pretender was even an impostor of the dead, son he had killed, and foreign intervention. This era, known as the Time of Troubles, 1598 to 1613, was one of the darkest in Russian history, a direct consequence of Ivan's failure to leave a competent heir and the terror he inflicted, which left the government unstable. Ivan the Terrible's own terrible actions, likely exacerbated by his ill health and unbalanced mind, set the stage for this chaos. It took the rise of a new dynasty, the Romanovs in 1613, to restore order. In sum, Tsar Ivan IV, the formidable gatherer of Russian lands, was himself gathered by death in a humiliating fashion, his body riddled with disease and toxins, and his final legacy one of dynastic ruin. He reminds us that even the most fearsome of rulers who can make their subjects tremble at a glance may be suffering and decaying from within, fighting demons in their blood that no cruelty can fend off. Ivan the Terrible's life ended in misery and madness, proving that no autocrat can escape the mortality that makes us all equal. 10 crowns, 10 broken bodies. Some raved, some rotted, some bled out under silk canopies. But all of them learned the same lesson. Power cannot bargain with disease. Their empires marched on, but their flesh would not. Remember them not just as kings, but as men, fragile, failing, and finally finished.